Good morning to everybody. I never imagined so many persons being here. I'm very pleased to collaborate with the course. And basically, I'm going to talk about governance and interdisciplinarity due to my experience working on issues of environmental governance and mainly on water governance, not necessarily on oceans or coastal regions, but I have been engaged together with Professor Alexander Turra, and he's also part of a project that we are developing now on macro-metropolitan Sao Paulo and facing climate change, and with several issues and areas of work. One of them is the coastal region of the north coast of the state of Sao Paulo. To present myself very shortly, I am an economist and sociologist, and I have been working and a PhD in sociology and full professor until very recently of the School of Education and the Institute of Environmental Energy and Environment. And now I retired from the School of Education, only I'm involved with the Institute of Energy and Environment. And I have been working with issues of governance, as I mentioned, with water, also with solid waste, and now also with climate. So my main approach and the issues I will bring to you are dealing initially with governance and with my personal experience on interdisciplinarity. And we have two different sessions. I wonder how we work if I make a presentation, but feel free to make questions during my presentation also. And I will not ask your names because you're too many, and either your countries, but I'm very pleased to dialogue during the whole talk with you. Basically, talking about governance, which is a word that can be differently understood, I will make a presentation which is basically looking at the issues of a short story of the concept of governance. Then I will talk about the different meanings of the concept of governance, governance and governability, and and discussing also the different new approaches to governance, because and also the discussions on how international relations looks at governance. I will discuss with you how to think about a socio-political approach to governance, and maybe with your own experiences in your countries, we can also establish a dialogue in terms of how this issue is developed or how this issue is presented. So it's important to bring up here, sorry. So the first question is, what is governance for you? No? So when we look at governance and from a historical perspective, we have to think that initially the challenges towards towards governance and mainly water governance have become a global issue and demand an increasing awareness from the global society. We had recently the World Forum on Water in March in Brasilia, and this brought very relevant issues in terms of the aspects, for example, of access to water, the degradation of water, inequalities, access to water, and obviously when we talk about oceans, this issue is very significant. We also have to consider that one of the most relevant aspects when we talk about ocean is how the quality of waters of ocean is being degraded, the volumes of different types of waste that is expelled to the oceans, not only plastics that is very mentioned, but also the sewage in many countries is also expelled into oceans. No? So we have to, when we talk about the governance and water governance, we have to understand it basically in terms of the continuous aggravation of these sources and the need to, for example, limit the exclusion of important groups of mankind, which is basically, has to be basically seen as an aspect of the lack of governance. Here in São Paulo, we suffered a very serious water crisis, 2013 to 2015, and this has to do, obviously, also with climatic aspect, but mainly, in my understanding, to issues of governance. So, when we talk about water scarcity, we have to look at this issue, or when we look at environmental governance related problems, as, for example, the reduction of biodiversity, the difficulties to reduce waste in our society, obviously the issue of climate change, which is probably the most complicated because it has to do with large agreements between international players. No? Other issues are much more related to initiatives of governments or of regions. No? But when we look at these aspects, we have to see them basically as an outcome of the lack of socio-institutional actions and the issue of governance transfers or overcomes aspects more linked to management. This is the first aspect that I want to stress, because when we talk about management, it's a much more related aspect to technical aspects. And when we talk of governance and obviously dealing, when talking about technical aspects, dealing mainly with the initiatives of government without any engagement of other actors. And when we talk about governance, we introduce civil society, and we introduce, obviously, economic actors within this process. So this is the first argument I want to stress. Obviously, this indicates that when talking about governance, we also need to consider the importance that civil society has within this process and how civil society can be engaged, mobilized, and basically be a stakeholder within a process that is much more complex because it deals with demands when a technocratic approach just deals with the issue or the issue being called, say, an investment, no? So this aspect represents, the use of the term governance reflects the shift that in social sciences and policy spheres to move from discussions focused on governance to a broader aspects of governance, which relates what I mentioned now, the role of non-state actors. This concept is introduced in a more broader approach besides the so-called political science range or area of understanding after the 70s, when the traditional forms of government are being questioned as to their capacity to coordinate the collective actions and are facing the new challenges that globalization brings. Basically, globalization of commerce and the revolution of telecommunications. And this also has an impact on the different logics, be they local, global, or entrepreneurial. And due to this increasing complexity, governance becomes an issue of the new modernity that is embedded in the logic of different forms of government, local governments, territories, and enterprises. So this concept broadens effectively the understanding of management because other actors are introduced within the process. And this implies also that these other actors are being more informed, understand better the processes that take place with their engagement. Say, for example, water basin councils or other types of councils represent in a certain way a new approach because when you create water basin councils, for example, or other types of councils, you create the possibility of actors of civil society in their different roles being part of a process of decision making. So that's an important aspect to be considered. A short story about governance. Here I put a moving etymology, a disciplinary approach, an international perspective, and a socio-political perspective. So when we talk about a moving etymology, it derives from a Latin term, gubernare, or from the Greek term, kubernan, which means to steer a ship. But here, when we look at it, I didn't put all the details in the slides because I prefer to talk than to put the slides. But anyhow, slides are just a reference, no? So we would call a steering concept. But basically, in the 14th century, in the Middle Ages in England, explained how different constitutive bodies of the medieval society share power. In France, it is mentioned for the first time in the 13th century within the Enlightenment period, and it represented an illustration of the willingness to combine an enlightened government with a respect to people's interests and value. The term governance has so been initially used as an equivalent to government, art or the way to govern, in the 13th century. Afterwards, in the 14th century, it received in England the equivalent denomination of governance, action or way to govern. It then lost its importance as a concept and is brought to sight only in the beginning of the 20th century, where this concept is explained, a whole set of mechanisms implemented basically within the entrepreneurial segment. And later it gets also being considered by economists and by international relations approaches. Why is this historical approach important? To show that all concepts has a root, we have to have an understanding that this didn't fall from the sky or was invented just to explain a certain process. But definitely this brings up as an idea that indicates that much before our era, leaders or so-called regions and afterward countries bring up the issue of government and bring up the issue of the way how to govern. But looking up now, for our era, I would say from the 80s, we hear a lot about entrepreneurial governance. And that implies basically in the strategies of how companies bring up the issues linked to their organization and obviously to their competitive strategies. So when we talk about the concept of governance, it has different meanings and applications in different contexts, characterizing a combination of something that is descriptive but also normative. Some refer to governance on a larger scale used by the United Nations or for non-governmental governance, corporate governance, which regards private actors that aim to ensure the accountability of management to the various stakeholders of a company. So when you talk about the governance and considering how companies are organized with a board of governance, a board that controls the dynamic of its functioning, it implies also in a strategy of how this company can survive competition, for example. No? But also we have to look at the types of governance that are more appropriate at the city or country levels, and there has been also some ideas or some ways of presenting conceptually also talking about good governance. But this is very tricky to deal with the issue of good governance because for some it may be good governance when it is very efficient, but efficiency doesn't necessarily deal clearly with issues of reducing, for example, inequality or dealing with a more democratic approach, for example, that engages different actors within a process. So the terms that are being more and more used when we talk about governance are, for example, transparency, accountability, and also, obviously, effectiveness, but engaging in effectiveness together with these other ideas. And also, it's important to consider policy from an approach of multi-level governance, where different actors are being part of the process, which regards the challenge of articulating independent public actions towards shared objectives at different geographic levels. For example, I myself have been, in a certain moment, a representative of the University of São Paulo in the water board or in the watershed council of the metropolitan region of São Paulo. And there I had to deal with different situations, different approaches, take decisions, and that implied that we were dialoguing at multi-level because we were civil society, state government, and municipal government. So there we have clearly an approach where civil society organizations have to be more and more involved. And what we see, unfortunately, is that due to different situations in some countries, obviously, governments do not want to see too much organization of civil society. The decisions are taken top-down. And when we talk about governance, we're talking about a dialogue between the top and so-called the bottom, because we as citizens are the bottom. Is it clear? Somebody wants to question, to discuss? Can I continue? Okay. So these are some slides. I can leave them for you to see them. Here I present already. Here also. So what we see, for example, is that today we are in a very troubled moment of global governance because of the disruptive role of the government of US in all different arenas where some decisions can be taken. No? So we see every day some kind of disruption by the Trump government in terms of international relations and in terms of developing something that is absolutely needed in modernity, that it is dialogue and cooperation in terms of very strategic decisions. Say, the case that we can look more in a more deep understanding is climate. When US leaves the climate agreement, obviously we have there a very serious problem of governance, because one of the most relevant players, and when we talk about players, it's because it has an important role in terms of the missions, doesn't play the game. So when we have this kind of situation, obviously in the process of globalization and in all levels that imply also the need of more cooperation between these agents, this implies a disruptive process of an agenda of global governance. And governance is also related with issues that I have shown before, that is the way that society is informed. Because when society is badly informed and where there is lack of transparency, obviously society is in an inferior role in terms of the capacity to be involved in decision making. So governance implies in the enlargement of actors involved in making public action and facing governments leaded to a need to redefine the process of thinking public action and public decision making. So how much are we prepared to be engaged in a process of multi-level governance? When you think about your expertise and your willingness to be engaged in a social process, representing society as a stakeholder in a civil society organization or other types of engagement, this implies obviously a situation where we are dealing more and more with something that is very clearly complex. And governance of, when we talk about governance and talking about oceans, obviously we're dealing with very, very complex issue. One of the aspects I mentioned already is pollution, but the others are overfishing, the others are the way that that we can look at processes that need cooperation and dialogue between the different stakeholders. Maybe you that are more involved than me in oceans directly can bring these issues also into discussion. So when we also looked at governance, we can see that in many cases we have to overcome a logic of hierarchies. And at international level, we had in general in international relations looking at an international hierarchical control. And this also implies that there is a need of regulation. We can see, for example, in international relations, how different attitudes of countries have implied, for example, in non-agreement, say, for example, in the Middle East, no? Between Israel and Palestine, for example. No? And we can see that also in other situations. Now, that's the one I just recalled as in this moment. No, but a governance in our era, or a multi-level governance in our era, indicates the need of networks to be more and more, to be stronger. No? Networks of member state representatives, networks linking the national and the regional levels of decision making, and networks linking public and private actors across policy sectors. So what is the big issue today when we talk about democracies is the need to move from a more interventionist state and hierarchical control to a more cooperative forms of governance. But unfortunately, we see that this is not necessarily taking place. There are many cases, and obviously you are also well informed to know the different situations or different countries in which the mainstream is of hierarchical control. When we talk of governance, also, it's important to strengthen the idea that there can be a confusion between governance and governability. Because for a long time, the word governance simply meant governing, government being seen as a process. But today, however, the term governance is mostly used to indicate a new mode of governing, different from the old hierarchical model. So governing refers basically non-hierarchical mode of governance, and governability implies in the way how governance can take place. No? So what we have seen in many countries, that to have governability implies in coalitions. And the Brazilian case is a good case to show what implied the linking governability, and then when governability breaks up, you have an impeachment because the actors, there is an erosion between the different actors in terms of the political struggle of the relations of power. So it's important to understand governance and governability. And obviously, in our times, it's not easy to guarantee democratic governability. That's an issue that we also have to consider. So the concept of governability is broader than that of governance. Both are interrelated and condition themselves. So governability can be understood as the agreement that gives basis to the conditions to govern, and governance as the agreement that allows the coordination. But this is a big issue. Theory is not necessarily always linked to practice. No? So we have to look the fact that although the word means as agreements, in many cases agreements are just for convenience, but not because of an agenda of cooperation, an agenda of an effectiveness of the processes of governing. So theoretically, governability means political and institutional stability and effectiveness in decision-making and administrations, and it relates to the continuity of rules and institutions, and to the pace, consistency, and intensity of decisions. So we want governability because if you don't have governability, you have some kind of disruption, chaos, disorganization, conflicts. But mankind is not such an easy type of doesn't imply necessarily that our ideas of governability are those that are really at stake. We have to see, obviously, that governability depends on governance. So this depends also theoretically talking, because I'm introducing you to some concepts, but the real world doesn't necessarily always dialogue with the concept. It's a general concept, and then in each of your realities you can see it in a different way. So here we talk about the level of maturity in an organized society in its capacity for assuming shared responsibilities in the implementation of decisions and in the art of governing well. So we all would like to see more and more being well governed, but what we see in general is that we are much more governed by conveniences, agreements between the stakeholders that have a hierarchical position within the governance structure. So governability refers to a measure of how governable particular environmental system is such. And such system is always comprised of two parts: a system to be governed and a governing system. When we talk about ocean, it's that also. We're talking about a system to be governed. Although there are agreements, in most cases when it comes to United Nations agreements, they are voluntary, but they are not necessarily compulsory. So it's much more sometimes that countries agree rhetorically, but then they don't do their homework, and this implies obviously in ingovernability. So governability depends on the interaction between these two systems. So governance is linked to the idea of its ability to govern. And what we see in general, that the concept has much more a clear top-down dimensions and refers to the governance capacity to exercise the direction of societies. And it's also important to present, here I'm talking about World Bank governance, and World Bank began to develop the idea of governance when engaging mainly in aspects linked to the efficiency of how the money lended by World Bank was being used. And obviously this brings up the discussion about how to make governments do better governance of its resources, and obviously bringing up the whole discussions on corruption in government actions. That was mainly the role of how World Bank defined and lended money for investments in countries that had a so-called, as I mentioned here, control related to a society resource management in order to guarantee its own social and economic development. But that's also, in many cases, purely rhetorical. No? So that's a big issue of how World Bank brought the idea of governance. No, say, help the development of developing countries, but having a better control of how the money is being used. And unfortunately, we have a ranking of corruption in countries, and we see how much this problem has been global. No? So it's important to bring up also the discussion that governance underlies the confrontations between intellectual and political traditions, which frequently, as I mentioned, represent irreconcilable opposing principles, values, and proposals. but basically also lack of transparency, accountability, and somehow, although in democratic countries, also an authoritarian approach to the use of resources. So, frequently incompatible policy strategies and decisions are taken, given that democratic governance is a political process characterized by the confrontation of rival political projects grounded on different values and principles. And where does this take place? Well, in a situation, in a context, in an arena where besides government, there is a democratic processing where Congress plays a role. But obviously we know that in many countries, Congress is very subordinated to the executive, what do we call it? Executive branch. So the concept of governance focuses on the transformation of forms of government and regulation that transcend the traditional state hierarchy and market system. From this perspective, governance represents a process resulting from the articulation of the classic forms of authority embodied by the state hierarchical organization with those characteristics of the private sector, driven by market competition, and the voluntary sector or civil society characterized by citizens, voluntary action, reciprocity, and solidarity. Well, we see this as a very interesting approach, but there are critiques to this approach in terms that not necessarily market, state, and civil society are partners, but there are contradictions, and basically there are asymmetries. And when you participate in a, as I did, in a water basin council, you see very clearly the asymmetries, because the relations of power are very, in this case, very transparent. And this obviously brings up an issue where, in many cases, civil society reduces its participation because it really feels that it is in a kind of fake logic of engagement, where the decisions have been already taken, and obviously it depends on civil society to be capable of questioning and bringing up the demands of a democratic governance, if we want to call it that way. No? So we have here the theoretical concepts, and obviously we have to remember and never forget that citizens are the responsible for whom they vote, and who they vote are those who define in certain ways the dynamics of governance. No? So this is important to be considered. So here, looking at the socio-political arena, we have multiple stakeholders. We have an interdependence, sorry, I don't know what happened here, between political and administrative bodies, shared goals, blurred limits between public, private, and non-governmental bodies, and multiple actions. So this should be considered as the real understanding of governance in terms of coordination, but this doesn't necessarily happen. No? So we also have to look at the fact that when we talk about the concept of governance, we are somehow bringing up the possibility of a new way of dealing with relations of power, and basically of dealing with a more horizontal dynamic in terms of the role of the different actors and interdependence. So we can look at this from a more naive perspective, or we can look at from a more, a more normative and sometimes naive perspective, or look at from a perspective of the relations of power that are really taking place. No? Although the idea is that networks include cooperation, delegation, and competition, this can not necessarily be the main way of it taking place. So here, talking about governance as auto-organized networks, stakeholders networks are auto-organized, autonomous, and self-governance. Well, this implies obviously in less authority by the state and more in collective actions by using decision support tools. Here I had a mentioning of a French author basically saying that the process of coordination of actors, of social groups, institutions to reach the main goals discussed and defined collectively in fragmented environments and uncertain. Because that's also an important word to be used. Uncertainty, complexity, and the need of actors to be really involved. We can see today that there is a very small number of worldwide organizations that defend the interests of civil society. I can give you one example, which is Greenpeace. And I'm a member of the board of Brazil Greenpeace. And we see how complex it is really to get into these arenas, to be able to mobilize civil society actors to be more supportive of the action. Because sometimes when you talk about these kinds of organizations, people say, but how can I be engaged? These are professional organizations, and voluntary actions are also very difficult to organize, no? And I know the case of Brazil. And basically, it had more voluntary initiative, but it became very chaotic to organize. So what we see today, and I have been member in the 2000s, and now in the two recent periods, I'm still a member. We jumped from 15,000 members to 100,000 members in Brazil. And this indicates that more people are really mobilized by the role that an organization like Greenpeace and others, but the difference between Greenpeace and other organizations is that Greenpeace depends basically on the support of us citizens. It has no resources from private companies or other types of organizations. That makes a big difference, because sometimes when NGOs, and I have a long story since the end of the 70s involved with NGOs, in many cases NGOs become hostages of those companies that finance them. I will not give names here because it's not ethical to say it. But definitely we have to look at this on a perspective, on an approach that indicates the importance that civil society has to promote the question of public policy. I can mention another organization like Amnesty International, and there are some organizations, say, and other type of organizations are more linked to help, no? Really, like Médecins Sans Frontières, no? For example, and other organizations that have been essential. Journalists Without Frontiers, that make also the questioning of how news are being presented by leading newspapers also. So this implies that we are part of governance. And when we are part of governance, this also represents the need of being more and more involved in the understanding and development of public policies. No? Obviously, when we are minority, we will be always defeated. And that's a big issue to be considered. You're young, please engage in different civil society organizations because it's absolutely essential to make things be different. And also we have to consider the heterogeneity of stakeholders. That's also very complicated. When you deal, say, in a water basin committee, you're dealing with the business community. We are dealing simultaneously with grassroots movements. You're dealing with, mentioning NGOs, you're dealing with academics, you're dealing with unions, you're dealing with different type of actors that not necessarily have the same agendas. And that implies also in the need of very strong notions of how to negotiate. Because the big issue is that governance, when we talk about governance and governability, we don't want to get to zero sum. We want to add, no? And that is essential when we talk about the agenda of the agenda that brings up a possibility of negotiations, no? So also it's important to consider, let me see, what is the next slide? Here we can also talk about something that's relevant that I mentioned a little bit before. International meetings have been more relevant than today. What we see is that the first conference on environment was in 1972. Probably none of you were born, no? So this implied that you brought issues to an agenda that didn't exist before. Basically, the issue of pollution. And air pollution was mainly the issue. Other aspects were also relevant. And what we saw that in the more recent conferences, I'm not talking about the climate because this is a specific agenda, but in the more recent conference, most of them were very fragile, very insipid, with very irrelevant almost outcomes. But they were relevant in terms of putting people together to strengthen agendas, but not necessarily in terms of outcomes. And this is contradictory when we look at it in terms of how globalization demands more and more that these issues are being considered as an element of agreement and development of stronger initiatives to strengthen, obviously, an environmental agenda in a world where the word that we read more and more in the front pages is different situations of degradation. Degradation of environment, catastrophes, and obviously this deals with something where we begin to talk also in terms of the word interdisciplinarity. When we talk about agendas of policies, we talk about intersectoriality. But when we talk about the knowledge to be intersectorial, we talk about interdisciplinarity. And myself, I'm engaged in the program of environmental science of the University of São Paulo since 1995. This was created in 1990. And nobody really was serious about what this program was doing, no? Very little. So we are a combination of Don Quixotes, no? And today we are very well known, we are considered one of the 3 best programs in the country. But this is basically to our conviction about the importance of dealing with the role of interdisciplinarity in capacity building of public policy makers, NGOs, consultants, etc. Business, obviously. And interdisciplinarity has to be seen basically not as a fetish, but it has to be seen as a need. That dealing with interdisciplinarity implies that we strengthen dialogues between different types of knowledge. I have been engaged together with Professor Chura's group of research, bringing up the issues of governance and social learning, and this has been an outcome in several theses and masters and PhD, and this makes me really believe in the important role that we need to have when talking about interdisciplinarity, because there is still a logic of fragmentation of knowledge. And when we come to discuss governance, and in this case governance in oceans, the main aspect to begin with is what questions do we want to answer? And why do we want to answer? And how do we want to answer? And in many cases, if we have only an argument based on so-called different frameworks of approach, be it on social sciences or be it on physical sciences, it may be insufficient. So we need to be able to strengthen these dialogues, and it's that it's not easy, obviously, basically because each of us has been created its own environments, knowledges, networks, and enclosures, knowledge enclosures. So this has to do also with governance, because the more interdisciplinary we are able to be, the stronger the ideas of governance can become because of an understanding of intersectoriality. Obviously, this has to do with the way the decisions are being taken, because in many cases we want to be intersectorial, but the governments do not allow us to be because there are already vested interests that are being prioritized, and that implies in the reduction of the possibilities of a more intersectorial approach. So in this case, when we looked at the ideas of environmental governance, it's probably the approach that needs most the interdisciplinary understanding. And interdisciplinary understanding implies also in a way of how we see the dialogue that we establish between science and society. And here I bring up an understanding on which I believe very much, that it is the idea of talking of an approach of post-normal science, of amplifying the community of peers. And this implies, obviously, in a way of enlarging dialogues in society. This concept of post-normal science was developed in the beginning of the 90s by 2 authors, Funtovics and Ravets, and it has been increasingly presented, this discussion, in the first article was presented in the journal called Futures. And now recently, these days, I was looking at another volume of Futures that presents more updated articles, not by these authors, also by these authors, but bringing up the discussion. Many scientists see this in a very, I wouldn't say negative, but not necessarily affirmative way. And I personally consider that we can only make more democratic science, and science that is really linked to a more democratic, looking for a more democratic governance, because we need also more democratic stakeholders and better informed stakeholders. And this shows us exactly the whole systemic, or the whole logic in terms of system that we need to develop. As I mentioned, let me see here what other slides I have. So, when we come to talk about complex systems, we talk about contradictions, and we talk about different types of understandings, and we talk about different approaches and different interests. And basically, we have to look in terms of what is at stake. And obviously on environment, what is at stake basically is the idea of protecting common resources, but at the same time creating better means of governing these resources with actors that have different approaches, with actors that are being protected by governments to do predatory initiatives. And when it comes, obviously, as I mentioned, in terms of oceans, the whole overfishing is one aspect to be more and more considered, because this has been implying in the loss of biodiversity. No? And also when it comes to oceans, the issue of marine pollution, that is, we are flooded with informations, pictures in Facebook about marine pollution, no? Straws and all the plastics and the birds and the turtles and the fishes that are being captured by our predatory way of consumption also. So that's complexity, because what we can see is that there is more awareness being created, but awareness sometimes is very insufficient in terms of how governments deal with this issue. Many governments still have very serious deficits in terms of basic sanitation, and this obviously implies in higher levels of pollution. Many governments are strengthening vested interests in fishing and do not promote any kind of interference in terms of the logic of these companies in terms of their fishing practices. And in many cases, there's what we see is that still basically there is a very strong lack of governance at the global level. And this implies also that when you have a weaker participatory engagement, the, say, vested interests and governance continue the mainstream or the so-called business as usual logic to deal with these. No? Um, so I think that we can bring up in terms of our discussion some main concepts and try to deal with the concepts. Basically looking at these concepts as part of an understanding of how the world is being governed, considering that although there are organizations at the global level, in many cases they are insufficient in terms of convincing, of mobilizing societies and their governments to change their practices. We still see very clearly these predatory practices not only at the level of oceans, but at the level of mining, at the level of working relations, at the different levels of actions and public policies that indicate how we have to look in terms of the ways of bringing up the different actors to engage in a process that reduces the negative processes that are taking place. So, what does this imply in terms of modernizing public policies? What does this imply in terms of new forms of multiple coordination and non-hierarchical procedures? What does this implies in a more rational way, if we can call it that way, in terms of transferring power to different actors and not concentrated actors? What does it imply in terms of promoting empowerment? How do we promote empowerment when we talk about these new forms of governance? Many people see that engaging in internet activities is a way of participating. Okay, it's a way of sometimes multiplying actors and signing documents, but definitely we have to be more and more engaged as citizens in real situations, in real arenas that take place. And say, when you represent a students' organization within a university to bring up inequities, irregularities, you are representing some initiatives, some demands, some reactions to something that you consider to be inadequate in terms of the processes of how, say, a university is being governed. No? So what is important to be strengthened is to see first that when we talk about the way of a more democratic governance is because the state has been failing in the solution of problems that affect people on a common ground. And when we talk about the different situations of environmental problems that were generated, we can also see how much this implies that society has to be much more reflexive. Because when we talk about society to be reflective, and this is a space where society is being reflective, because we are, at this moment, I'm talking, you're very silent, but in the second after the break, you bring up your issues and questions, because that makes a more democratic discussion. And definitely, what we have to see is that democracy is reflected in the practices of government and its increasing complexity, because this implies that these social actors organize themselves to question these contradictions. And we are a world full of contradictions. And to conclude this first moment, what we see is that we are effectively living on a turning point. If you see the news these days, what happened with the heat waves. The heat waves in Europe have been absolutely very impressive. The fires taking place in California that specialists say it will be able to reduce their strength in 2 months. So you cannot, today you see that you cannot just simply say we are able to cope with fire. No? We have to look more and more to the ways that urbanization is taking place, because the multiplication of extreme events indicates something essential. Our cities are not prepared for extreme events, and that also has to do with urban governance or regional governance. And we have to look at how in the future, and this IPCC indicates that crops will be shifting from areas of the world to other areas because of the changes that climate change is indicating. And when it comes to oceans, bringing up the aspects of the elevation of the level of the oceans, and how this is implying also in the real possibilities that countries or islands disappear. And this has to do also on a social-cultural approach of governance. When you had the last forums of on climate, no? the COPs, the main actors that overwhelmed these discussions were the small islands of the Pacific and the Indic Oceans, showing that disappearing, no? It's like science fiction, no? Imagining that a society that created its identity, that created its culture, that created its existence, may disappear, and being like being in a wrecked boat, going to another place where they have no identity, no relations to it. This is significant to think about it, no? In no moment of human mankind, society was so challenged to be able to deal with global governance. And when we see that, basically because climate change brings up to society something that it has to be dealing to humankind, mankind mainly, no? It has to be dealing collectively. So the idea of disappearing, the idea of extinction, the idea of reduction of species, all these aspects indicate also, and have also a very relevant aspects in terms of the engagement of the different actors in the governance of oceans. I'll stop here, but I want then to have your reactions, and I can bring up some questions for us to discuss in the second part, because I don't like silence when we talk in a group of, I don't know how many people are here, at least 100, no? If not more. Thank you very much.